Alright, so I'm recording right now. Gonna start the live stream in about 5 minutes. So yeah. Um so I'm just doing some pre-streaming thoughts. Because if you're on my Patreon channel, you will get a special extended edition of about 5 minutes before the live stream. So yeah, these are just my random thoughts poured out onto the interwebs. Because I first saw Star Wars Return of the Jedi in movie theaters back in 1983. It was at a movie theater, a neighborhood movie theater called, uh, God, I can't remember the name, but it was on the corner of Lorraine and uh, no, not Rockside Road. What was it? Not Warrensville Center. Rocky River Road or Rocky River Boulevard. There was this area called Cam's Corners. It was this little shopping district on the west side in Old West Park neighborhood, and so it was like the Cam's Corners movie theater. It's gone now. There's a Walgreens there in its place. So yeah. In fact, I saw a number of movies there at that location. It was one of them was Back to the Future when it came out in 1985. I remember that. Uh, I believe I also saw Star Trek 3: The Search for Spock there. So yeah, I saw quite a few of my early childhood movie going experiences at that theater. So we saw Return of the Jedi, and that was my first big screen introduction to Star Wars. I was too young to remember the original if my dad ever took us to see it. um, because it's 1977 and I was only 3 years old at that time. So, then of course, The Empire Strikes Back. I don't remember if I ever got taken to see that. I don't think I did, but Return of the Jedi was the first time I can remember seeing Star Wars on the big screen. So, yeah, and of course we had, Star Wars toys and everything like that, and just to see how far it's fallen since then is just incredible. So yeah, it's sad. Uh, because I grew up liking Star Wars. I had a C-3PO costume that I wore for a couple of years in the 80s. And my younger brother, I think, had a Stormtrooper costume, if I remember correctly. Possibly not, I don't know. I'm just rambling right now. But yeah, I mean, it just goes to show you, I was one of the early fans when the trilogy came out originally. Now, there was a lot I didn't know back then, and I'll discuss this during the live stream. But yeah, uh, if you're watching this on Patreon, then you'll have this as an early extended cut. But yeah, it's bad. It's really bad. So yeah, you're going for about 4 minutes into the recording now, and I'm gonna start streaming at 12 noon when my clock hits the 12 and the two zeros. 1,200 hours, people. Yeah. So this is what it's come down to for Star Wars: The Rise of Palpatine, or The Fall of Skywalker. No thanks to Bob Iger and Disney, and his flunkies Kathleen Kennedy, Jar Jar Abrams, and Ruin Johnson. Okay, we are live now, and I'm going to start streaming now, and we'll wait and see if anyone pops up in chat before I get a start, but yeah, we'll see what happens. Alright, so I'm going to start the music now. It's the Wilk Report. I'm Michael Wilk, coming to you from Cleveland, Ohio, doing a live stream eulogy for Star Wars. And I never thought I would have to be doing this because, uh, when Disney bought Lucasfilm in 2012, I was cautiously optimistic because it meant that we were going to see more Star Wars movies. Because we were just like, what, 6 or 7 years out from Revenge of the Sith. I think that came out, what, 2004, 2005, maybe? So, it had been a while, and, George Lucas wasn't getting any younger. His own kids weren't, I guess he decided they weren't going to succeed him in directing new Star Wars movies, and, I think after the backlash to the prequels, he didn't really want to dive into it because the prequels were not as well received as the original trilogy. And I think, a large part of the reason why the prequels didn't do nearly as well as the original, part of it had to do with the difficulties of trying to capture lightning in a bottle twice. It's a lot harder than it seems. But there's another aspect, and that is George Lucas as a storyteller. When he doesn't have his ex-wife editing and trying to slap his hands away from the keyboard, saying, "No, George, no, don't do this. Okay, you just violated your retconning." So yeah, I'm getting very low frame rate here. Lots of red alerts here as far as my streaming speed, but unfortunately, I do not have access to better Wi-Fi. So, but yeah, so I'm going to just keep going. All right, so if you're at all familiar with George Lucas, I mean, because the prequels basically did a quite a bit of retconning. It brought the droids in, particularly R2-D2 and C-3PO, which I felt were unnecessary. I also thought Qui-Gon Jinn, the character played by Liam Neeson, was unnecessary because at The Empire Strikes Back, during the scene where Luke has been attacked by the Hoth monster, that thing with the horns, kind of the Yeti-like creature, and he's escaped, and he's out in the snow, and he's freezing to death, and Obi-Wan's Force Ghost appears and says, "Go to Dagobah, there you will learn from Yoda, the Jedi Master who instructed me." So Qui-Gon Jinn in the prequels was really unnecessary. You didn't need him. All you needed was Obi-Wan Kenobi to meet Anakin Skywalker, and that was it. And then, of course, that Lucas couldn't seem to settle on whose story it was. Was it Qui-Gon Jinn's? Well, it was in the first movie. Was it Obi-Wan's? Well, it seemed to be in the second film, with Anakin's romance with Padme Amidala being a secondary story when it probably should have been the first. And then the third film, it was Anakin's and Palpatine's story, mostly Palpatine's. So, if you're trying to tell the story of how Anakin Skywalker fell to the dark side and became Darth Vader, it just came across as kind of ham-handed. It was still a lot better than what we're getting now, but oh my god. So, yeah, for those of you who are familiar with recent history, 2015, we got the awful The Force Awakens, directed by Jar Jar Abrams, which is nothing but a shallow retread of A New Hope, with pointless fan service and doubling down on things that have been done before, because Jar Jar Abrams has no originality or any thought or care for the material he's adapting. So yeah, this is just awful in terms of how low Star Wars has fallen, because now we've got him back directing The Rise of Skywalker, and it's actually not The Rise of Skywalker. It's The Rise of a Palpatine, who is usurping the Skywalker name because the Skywalkers were killed off in the new trilogy in ways that completely disrespected the characters. and it just makes clear that Disney either never had a plan or it did have a plan, which was simply to churn out movies in a never-ending saga of trilogies that would go nowhere and answer no questions because there was never meant to be an end. And the movie was shown to critics on Monday. It is now Friday, December 20th. But the movie was open to critics on Monday, and the reviews have not been kind. Rotten Tomatoes score, yeah, not all that great. So, I'm going to give you a little bit of history on Star Wars, and more specifically, a lot of the influences that went into the original. So, George Lucas was he's a baby boomer, born after World War II. He grew up watching, stuff like Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, and other Republic serials. So that was some of his early influences. And, he actually wanted to direct a Flash Gordon film. A lot of people don't remember that, but he wanted to direct a Flash Gordon film. The studios turned him down. After he got turned down, he decided to go off and do his own films, which were inspired in part by Flash Gordon. And that, of course, went on to become Star Wars, and, the rest is history. But, and of course, due to the success of Star Wars, we actually did end up getting a Flash Gordon movie starring Sam Jones and Max von Sydow as Ming the Merciless. But this is some of his early influence. And, then, there is, of course, World War II films. If you watched a lot of newsreels and historical stuff, you can't help but note the influence of World War II dogfights inspiring a lot of the space fight sequences in A New Hope. Because when the Millennium Falcon blasts its way out of Mos Eisley, then of course you go ahead and see the space battle right before they get pulled into this Death Star. A lot of this is inspired by that, and you can't help but notice all these influences. In fact, actually, another influence from World War II, if you pay attention towards the end of the first film, and spoilers for people who haven't seen it, and if you haven't, why not? It was over 40 years ago, so, after more than 4 decades, you've got no business complaining. But of course, we all know that, at the end of the first Star Wars film, they blow up the Death Star, and there's a ceremony giving Luke and Han medals for their bravery, although Chewbacca doesn't seem to really get one. I don't know why. And then, of course, there's the droids. But that whole scene, where the guys are walking down the aisle, and you've got all the rebel army on either side and they're going towards the platform to get their medals. That one shot was lifted directly from Triumph of the Will, directed by Leni Riefenstahl. Of course, Triumph of the Will was this Nazi propaganda film. Now, George Lucas is Jewish, okay? So, he studied, cinema. He went to film school, presumably. So, but he would have grown up, watching a lot of this stuff, and all this kind of poured into his brain and, influenced him heavily. And so you had, film school taking film history and film theory, and how cinema actually influences people. And, Triumph of the Will is still taught in film school because of its impact on the human psyche. And, yeah, George Lucas would have seen that, and he recreated that, a scene from that propaganda movie in the award ceremony for A New Hope. So, yeah, there's a little bit of historical history there. So, but, he was also influenced by director John Ford and westerns of the 50s and early 60s. He was influenced by Akira Kurosawa, because you can actually see a lot of influence. Because there's elements of westerns, and in fact, actually, going back to John Ford and westerns in general. If you look at Mos Eisley's Space Cantina, and this is actually uh, where you see a lot of Western influences. Uh, they pull up to the cantina after uh, Luke has agreed to go with Obi-Wan Kenobi after his parents were killed by Imperial stormtroopers, looking for the droids. And, so they go to Mos Eisley, and Obi-Wan says, never will you find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. And uh, the whole sequence on Mos Eisley plays out like a Western, where they're going to this backwater Old West town, except it's on another planet, and it's like futuristic space technology and laser swords and ray guns, basically. Uh, and that's where we get our first taste. They go into the cantina, and right off the bat, Luke is making a bad impression. The droids are not welcome because there's an anti-droid bias. There's really, the scene where he runs afoul of the two bar patrons, and one of them gets his arm sliced off. That walrus-looking guy. Obi-Wan ignites his lightsaber and cuts the guy's arm off. Because he's warned him, this place can get a little rough. And Luke, obviously being a fish out of water, he's a country boy. He's a farmer. He's not someone who normally goes into town unless it's to maybe buy parts from the garage for his speeder or whatever. So so he's very naive at this point, and he needs people to get him out of trouble. And then, of course, we see the infamous scene between Han Solo and Greedo, the Rhodian with the bug eyes and the little flapping lips. And, this is something that George Lucas actually kept trying to tweak in the special edition version of the movie, where, he felt he didn't like the way the scene was originally written and executed, so he kept trying to make it so okay, Greedo shot first, so Han wouldn't look like a murderer. Well, Han was never a murderer, because again, we're seeing Western influences, okay? And that whole scene with Han Solo reinforces a couple of things. One, it establishes, it reinforces, just how rough a place Mos Eisley can be, and what the sort of things you need to do just to survive there. And two, it kind of introduces Han Solo as someone he's a good guy, and he can outwit at least a dumbass like Greedo, because Greedo is so busy gloating over a victory he didn't even have yet. He was so busy flapping his lips he didn't notice Han Solo drawing on him under the table, and so he ends up getting shot. But it establishes Han Solo as a good guy, but he's not so good that his nobility eclipses our main hero, who's Luke Skywalker. And so this serves, multiple purposes. And so, I think George Lucas really hurt himself as a storyteller by constantly going back and trying to retweak that scene along with others in the special editions. So, that's where we get the Western influences. And of course, then we get moved on to Kurosawa films, and the robes worn by the Jedi, like Obi-Wan and Yoda, and, eventually Luke in Return of the Jedi. They're very much patterned on the robes worn by samurai without their armor. And Darth Vader's armor is patterned after the samurai armor of the Middle Ages. So, and of course, the lightsabers are meant to stand in for katanas, and katanas are actually two-handed weapons. They're not something you can, unless you've got a really powerful arm, you're not going to be able to really swing it much, because it's designed to be used with two hands, for sweeping strikes and bringing it down on an enemy instead of stabbing. So there's a lot of influence from Kurosawa films, and like Yojimbo and Seven Samurai, and then of course there's possibly the biggest influence of all is J.R.R. Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, because Luke is very much like Frodo in The Lord of the Rings. Okay, he's the guy who is a hero. He's our identifying character. the main one around whom the action is centered, and he's going on this hero's journey. And of course, Obi-Wan stands in for Gandalf, and later so does Yoda. But interestingly enough, it's not Luke Skywalker who defeats Palpatine at the end of Return of the Jedi. It's Darth Vader, much like Gollum in Return of the King. And of Return of the Jedi, of course, is a play on the title Return of the King. But J.R.R. Tolkien, when he wrote that ending, much like the reason he wrote the ending of The Hobbit, we don't get to see the big final climatic battle between the heroes because it's Bilbo's story, and he's not a warrior. And Frodo, again, he doesn't defeat the ring. He doesn't defeat Sauron. He's not the one who casts the ring into the crack of doom at the end of Return of the King. Gollum steals the ring back from him, and he's dancing on the edge of the crack of doom, falls in, ring is destroyed. Because evil defeats itself. Tolkien's whole point was good doesn't always win because of heroes defeating the bad guys in battle. A lot of the times, evil defeats itself, and Darth Vader, who up to that point had been one of the bad guys, turns on his own master and defeats him. So yeah, we get a lot of these influences, and if you actually look at the original trilogy, with all these things going into it, I mean, how do you not see just how incredible this was? Because I was reading on Sean P. Carlin's blog where he quotes Geddy Lee of Rush on what originality is, and I don't. I'm not going to quote it verbatim, but essentially what Geddy Lee was saying, originality is when you've got so many influences that you can't even remember all of them, and you kind of filter them through your own mind, and as you develop your work, your own voice starts to come out from all these influences, and it becomes uniquely your own. And that's what George Lucas did with the original Star Wars trilogy, is he took all these disparate influences from World War II films and footage of dogfights and stuff like Triumph of the Will, which again probably would have offended his Jewish sensibilities because, yeah, I mean, it's a Nazi propaganda film, but, it just goes to show you how powerful cinema can be. And, of course, with his wife at the time editing, and, after they got divorced, I suspect the reason he doesn't want the original trilogy unaltered being remastered and released on their own was because he didn't want her to get the royalties because she had at least partial rights over them for her job as an editor. So at least that's the rumor. I don't know if that's true or not, but so yeah. But there were other things. There were political subtext in there, and a lot of people are complaining about politics being inserted into the original, into the new trilogy, but here's the thing: politics was all about Star Wars because, I mean, the evil empire, again, patterned after the Nazis. The uniforms were patterned after those of Nazis. The stormtroopers, again, Nazi stormtroopers, Imperial stormtroopers. It's the same. A lot of it was inspired by things like the McCarthy hearings of the 1950s, where they did communist purges, and we overthrew the Shah of we installed the Shah of Iran after overthrowing the government there in the 1950s. We invaded Korea to try and stop what we thought were advancing communist influences, and Korea remains divided to this day because of our refusal to let go and let countries run themselves. And it was actually the Democrats who started the Cold War after World War II, because we had defeated the Nazis, and we were trying to show the Soviet Union, look, when we bombed Japan with a nuclear weapon twice, uh, that wasn't because we wanted to end the war and save lives. No, that was never the reason. We used nukes on Japan to try to frighten the Soviet Union into submitting to United States power. And that backfired because instead of backing down, the Soviets actually developed their own nuclear weapons, and we had this arms race ever since. And now we're in Cold War 2.0, which, people are falsely accusing Caligula Drumpf, that great orange dope, who was elected dictator in 2016, and they didn't want him being conciliatory towards Russia. They wanted they hated that Russia voted Boris Yeltsin out in the early 2000s because he was a pliant puppet for American interests, and Vladimir Putin. He's beholden to Russian oligarchs, but they're not our oligarchs. And so, we've been trying to get rid of him ever since because he won't play ball. So, when the Democrats blew the 2016 election after rigging the primaries and stealing the nomination from Bernie Sanders to give it to criminally corrupt Hillary Clinton, they've been trying to blame Russia ever since. Now, there's plenty of crimes that Caligula Drumpf has actually committed in office, from emoluments violations to misappropriating funds to pay for his border wall, from caging children and leaving them to be abused, often sexually abused, disappeared into the system, tried as adults. Kids as young as 3 or 4 being tried as adults without legal counsel in immigration courts to deport them. Seriously, people. Torturing children. That is a crime. And of course, there's war crimes, in Syria after the faked gas attack over there, because we've been trying to overthrow the Syrian government, and he's been trying to extract us from some of these conflicts that were started by Bush and Cheney and then expanded by Obama. So yeah, there's a lot of the McCarthyite ideology that had survived from the 1950s all the way to today, and this was very much still in the minds of George Lucas and his peers when they were doing Star Wars, because the evil empire was actually a stand-in for, generally any authoritarian government, but it was more specifically the United States government and the hysteria and the authoritarianism that started kind of clamping down in the 1950s, and also it was a Vietnam War allegory because, again, it was the World War II generation and the Cold Warriors who started the war in Vietnam. And George Lucas came of age during the 60s, and he would have been part of that section of the baby boom generation that opposed the Vietnam War because we saw it for what it was, which is a war based on lies that didn't need to be fought, that primarily sent the poor to fight in place of the rich, because at least in World War II, everyone who was able to had to go fight. Rich, poor, black, white, didn't matter. That was a world war, and we couldn't afford to hold back able-bodied fighters. So, a lot of the politicians who ended up running the world later, like George H.W. Bush and Bob Dole, they were World War II veterans. And Bush Sr. had actually got shot down over the Pacific when he was fighting in the Japanese theater. And, but Vietnam, it was primarily a war waged by the rich, fought by the poor. And, that went on for roughly a decade. And, because we wanted to stop communism from spreading in East Asia. And, what they didn't realize was that Ho Chi Minh actually wasn't a true believer in communism. He was a nationalist, okay? He wanted Vietnam free of European and other Western powers. and he was lashing onto whatever system he thought would uh, bring the most, uh, the most likely to actually lead to Vietnam becoming uh, self-sustaining and able to defend its own interests. So, a lot of this stuff actually goes into the original Star Wars trilogy. And in fact, actually, Return of the Jedi, by that point, because it's 1982, 1983, uh, and by that point, Lucas is a different person from what he was in 1977, and it's more of a conciliatory story between the generation that waged the Vietnam War and the boomers who opposed it, because you've got like 20 years or whatever since separating the 60s from the 80s now, and so there's kind of like a redemption arc for Darth Vader, because basically the boomer son is kind of redeeming his World War II father from his conservatism, and and the father kind of like recognizing that he really didn't do right by his kid, and or by his entire generation. Basically, a lot of the sentiment of the boomers was that their parents had kind of betrayed the ideals that they had been taught in school that America had held with the McCarthyite hearings and wars like Korea and Vietnam and stuff like that. So, yeah, there's a lot of that going into there. So, a lot of people are, who bitch and moan about politics being in the new movies. Well, they're barking up the wrong tree on this one. Because politics has always been present in Star Wars, and for all people like Freddie Prinze Jr., rant and rave and say Star Wars is for fucking kids. Real nice, Freddie. You're a father yourself of small children, and you're using the F-bombs while talking about Star Wars, which you say is for kids. Well, to the extent that he's right, yeah, it is for kids, but it's also for adults, and everything I've just spoken about here was in Star Wars, and the adults would have gotten that. People like me who saw it in theaters for the first time as kids, we didn't get any of that. We were the Generation X generation, the ones who came after the boomers. And we were the ones who grew up with this stuff, but we never got the context. Our parents got the context. Our grandparents had the context. So there was a lot in it that was for them too, but you wouldn't have known it if you were a kid watching this in the theaters for the first time. And of course you get the prequel trilogy, which kind of parallels the rise of the Bush-Cheney regime, but also kind of the Hitler regime over in Nazi Germany. And in fact, there's a comment on one of my earlier videos this week where an Iraq and Afghan war veteran said, look, a lot of this was, a lot of us who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, we kind of lived the prequels, because, this is exactly the kind of shit that was going on, in real time as the prequels were being made. And, because we had September 11th, and we went into Afghanistan supposedly to get Al-Qaeda, but then that effort was abandoned, just basically to occupy Afghanistan indefinitely. We let Osama bin Laden go, and it wasn't until, 2011 or so that Obama finally decided, okay, well, we've known for years where he's been holed up. He was basically a prisoner in Pakistan because they wanted to use him as leverage against Al-Qaeda, which was trying to make incursions into Pakistan. So, yeah. So they went in and took out bin Laden, and of course lied about how he died. I mean, he didn't try and use his wife or kids as human shields. He was captured. They executed him, much like Saddam Hussein was executed, because he was a key witness to a lot of the shit that the United States government had done that was criminally negligent with regards to 9/11, and Because I'm not some conspiracy theorist. I don't believe in cockamamie bullshit like nanothermite or uh, planet explosives or remote control planes. None of that is remotely true. Uh, that's just people who've watched one too many episodes of X Files or Lone Gunmen and uh, believing the lies told by people who falsely claim to be architects and civil engineers. Well, they must have gotten their certifications out of Cracker Jack boxes because they don't even know basic metallurgy. Like, steel doesn't melt at 1500 degrees or 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, about the range that jet fuel burns, but it will weaken to the point where it becomes more plastic, malleable. And when steel is at that state, it's not going to hold up the weight of all those floors above it. Of course not. So naturally, it's going to collapse. So, I'm not someone who believes that, but that there is plenty of evidence that the Bush-Cheney regime was negligent with regards to 9/11. In fact, actually, former Senator Bob Graham had come out within the last couple years because he's privy to information that showed that, the Saudi government was involved in financing the hijackers, and apparently now we know, thanks to Freedom of Information Act, that the CIA was actually trying to recruit the hijackers to act as double or triple agents against Al Qaeda, and of course they failed. But that operation itself was illegal because the CIA is not allowed to operate within the United States, and here they were operating within the United States to go ahead and to try and recruit these guys, and they failed. And they protected these guys because they didn't want the operation being foiled by the FBI or other agencies. So there was a lot of clusterfuck of things going wrong where you had negligence, you had different agencies jockeying with the different operations, some trying to investigate and stop the hijackers, and others trying to protect them because they were trying to turn them into assets. So a lot of crap that just shows, because if any of this turns out to be true, and I think we need an actual investigation that's not a whitewash absolving people of guilt, I think you'll find that 9/11 was not only a massive intelligence failure, but it was also a clusterfuck of illegal operations that had no business going on, and rank incompetence. And that, to me, is a real conspiracy. Uh, but that you had stuff like that going on, and again, the contemporary politics of the prequels, was to show how liberty dies, by people handing it over to, with thunderous applause because, we were afraid, our leaders lied to us, they start wars that have no business being fought, then they take those wars and use them as a rationale to take away our liberties here at home. So, basically history repeating itself. And I think, that is something that people forget about George Lucas, is that, his movies were political. And yes, there was a leftist ideology within those political messaging within the first two trilogies. So, this extended rant I've been on for the better part of a half hour, it just is kind of give you background on all this stuff that people are complaining about within the new trilogy, but, they're kind of not really talking about that within the first two because George Lucas was involved in those. But he was a lot more subtle, and he didn't actually talk down to his audience. Disney talks down to its audience. It doesn't respect the intelligence of the audience to figure out things and understand what's going on. So it basically assumes that the audience is stupid. And that's what pisses me off more than anything else, because we've got a situation now where, because the studio assumes the stupidity of the audience, the scripts end up being dumbed down And what we see on the screen insults our intelligence and treats us as though we can't figure out uh, things like subtlety. Uh, but then they also uh, have fake woke politics, and a lot of people complain about SJWs in the new trilogies and in the Ghostbusters 26 movie, promoting wokeness or diversity for its own sake, and to the extent that the right wing SJWs are right, because there are right wing SJWs. Okay, a social justice warrior implies social justice war, and there are two sides in any war. So social justice warrior can mean you're either on the right or the left. And if you're on the left side, then yeah, you're probably going to want to promote diversity and uh, what's called wokeness. It's really not, because what's uh, old school wokeness, and I tend to try and write my screenplays because I am a screenwriter. I've been to film school. I'm trying to write some screenplays, get them submitted. Uh, but mine is old school woke, in that in that more traditional definition of you're woke to what's going on. Okay, like you're aware of uh, the government lying to you about things, about large business interests lying to you about their product and how toxic it might be, like with Monsanto and its weed killer Roundup, and how glyphosate uh, causes cancer, and the genetically modified organisms that are sold as produce are modified to be able to absorb Roundup, which has that cancer-causing agent in it, uh, without dying. Because Roundup is just basically it's an herbicide, and it doesn't. And herbicides typically don't discriminate, and they kill whatever is exposed to them. So the genetically modified organisms are altered so that they can absorb this stuff without dying, but you're still getting all that cancer-causing stuff in it. So so basically, being woke means you're aware of these kind of things, and what's happened with the social justice war is that you've got people on the right uh, attributing wokeness to being like agenda pushing for diversity and uh, kind of taking away uh, white people's rights by promoting the rights of traditionally oppressed groups, people like blacks, Hispanics, women, LGBTQ, whatever. Uh, and they act as though, somehow promoting these somehow takes away from us. Well, no, it doesn't. But hey, that's what they want to believe. Uh, I think it's being fundamentally dishonest. And I've got a comment saying I keep crashing for a minute. Yeah, that's the hazards of streaming with the poor Wi-Fi connection. Is that the the bit rate keeps dropping, so I don't. Unfortunately, there's nothing I can do about it. I'm in an area that doesn't have good Wi-Fi, and yeah, so that's on. Getting back to what I was saying. So you've got people on the right who complain about this so-called wokeness, but on the other hand, yes, you do have people who claim to be on the left, supposedly promoting all this stuff for equality, but it's corporate wokeness. It's empty wokeness because it's being used basically to market to target demographics. Because the way corporate mentality works is they do research studies to try and figure out how to market product to different groups, because they want to know the demographics of the people they're selling to. And what they're looking at when they do these research studies is that, yeah, customers are becoming younger as older generations die off. They're more diverse racially and ethnically, religiously diverse. Uh, there's a lot more people out of the proverbial closet now than there were 30, 40 years ago. So, they're looking at these statistics and they are tailoring their marketing to these target demographics, figuring that wrongly that the Gen Xers who grew up with this stuff and the boomers who created Star Wars, uh, they don't seem to be aware of physical media anymore and how we pass our love for these properties onto our children and our grandchildren. So, yeah, back. Okay, yeah, I'm back. And gone again. Yeah, so I do apologize. I'm recording this as well as streaming, but so I will have this up on the channel probably this weekend. Uh, but yeah, there's a lot of cutting out, and unfortunately, I'm just not in a position where I have access to good Wi-Fi. So, uh, yeah, so hopefully I'll be back again soon. uh, all right, so all right, yeah, I'm back, and I'll probably be going again in a minute. But yeah, so there's a, but so like I've been saying, and Stephen, I hope you'll tune in when this finally uploads and processes. But yeah, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it in its entirety, and I'll upload the recorded version later this weekend. So, but yeah, what we've seen here is targeting to specific demographics, and at the expense of ignoring the demographics who actually made this property so well loved in the first place. So Disney buys Lucasfilm from George Lucas for over $4 billion, and because Lucas wants to ensure that the outline he has for the sequel trilogy is actually implemented, he puts in charge at Lucasfilm someone he thinks is going to be on his side, Kathleen Kennedy, who's been the producer on Lucasfilm and Steven Spielberg's movies. But the problem is Kathleen Kennedy is a yes woman and a shameless suck up. She tells her bosses what they want to hear and carries out their wishes. So, as it turns out, she was no ally to George Lucas. So she basically did whatever Bob Iger demanded. And what Bob Iger demanded was to churn out Star Wars movies every year, like on a factory conveyor belt, which meant having to undo the end of Return of the Jedi, which ended the Star Wars and Skywalker story, pretty definitively. The extended universe was, for some reason, not considered viable for turning into movies, and I suspect it has something to do with the rights issues over, because a lot of authors, they get, and publishing companies, they get licenses to produce this content, and I suspect, although I cannot prove for certain, that a large part of the reason why the extended universe was rendered non-canonical was because of those rights issues. Yeah, because trying to pick one and go with it would it would mean having to pay out royalties and lose money, paying out those royalties to various authors that Disney just was not prepared to do. And Jar Jar Abrams, who was brought aboard to direct Episode 7, wanted to do his own thing. Now the thing about Jar Jar Abrams is that he is a no-talent hack. He is shallow, one-dimensional, fundamentally stupid. I mean, he's as far as being a movie maker, he's the only thing he's really good at is mimicry and doing the technical aspect of movie making. He's not an auteur. He doesn't know shit about actually telling stories. He's all about pushing a marketing gimmick, that magic mystery box, which is basically, if you're not familiar with that, there's a video on Cracked that goes into the 5 reasons movies suck today, and it actually exposes the magic mystery box for what it is, which is all the cheap shit that the magic store couldn't give away, so they toss it all into a box, charge you $15 for it, and claim it's $50 worth of magic, but it's probably closer to $5, so you're overpaying by $10, for crap. And that's the Magic Mystery Box, and that's what Jar Jar Abrams excels at promoting, because at the end of the day, that's all he's got. All right, the reason why his movies are so fast paced and don't give you time to digest what you're actually seeing was because if you actually had time to think about what you're seeing within that time frame that you're watching the movie, you wouldn't like it. You would probably get up and leave and demand a refund. So, he threw in Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber into The Force Awakens with no explanation for how it even got there, because the last time we saw that fucking thing, it was tumbling down a ventilator hole in Bespin Cloud City towards the planet below, a gas giant, never to be seen again until Dark Empire brought it back, postulating what if they found Luke's hand, and they used that to make a clone of him, which inherited his force powers, and then that's where they introduced Mara Jade, the Emperor's Hand, whose job was to assassinate Luke Skywalker, and she ended up killing the clone, but falling in love with the original. So, but if you're going to resurrect that element, you could have that as an explanation for how the lightsaber gets recovered, but they did away with that. So, there's no explanation for why Luke Skywalker's lightsaber from A New Hope gets into The Force Awakens. You're not meant to know. It's one of those setup questions that's never meant to be asking, and Jar Jar Abrams and Ruan Johnson and Kathleen Kennedy treat you like scum for expecting there to be any payoff or any answers to the questions being set up to never be answered. So yeah, so you had pointless fan service, you had alterations to the Millennium Falcon, to C-3PO, and Harrison Ford agreed to come back for The Force Awakens with the proviso, presumably, that Han Solo would be killed off, because it's no secret that Harrison Ford was done with the original trilogy after he did Return of the Jedi, and he wanted nothing more to do with Star Wars. Okay, he moved on as an actor. He had a very successful career in his own right, doing Indiana Jones and Jack Ryan and all these other films that he's been in. He wasn't keen on returning because, he is in his 70s. He doesn't want to be pigeonholed in his in the twilight of his career into doing Star Wars again. So, yeah, they decided they were going to kill off Han Solo in The Force Awakens, but the way they did it was to make him die like a bitch at the hands of his own son. You could have had him go out in a blaze of glory, but no. And then, of course, you make him into a deadbeat father who abandoned his wife and kid after the kid turned to the dark side. Come on. Basically, you destroyed Han Solo for no good reason, because Jar Jar Abrams doesn't know how to tell a good story. All he had was a directive from Kathleen Kennedy was, we have to undo everything that was accomplished in the original trilogy so that we can, keep going and, make it a forever story that never ends. So Jar Jar Abrams did what he was told. And, basically, Jar Jar Abrams, was the worst choice you could pick to direct a Star Wars movie. They could have put Ron Howard in and had him direct. You could have put Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni in and put them in charge of doing the movies, but they didn't want to. And in retrospect, The Mandalorian, doing quite well on Disney Plus. A lot of people like it. I'm one of them. That they've got people like Deborah Chow and Taika Waititi directing episodes. Dave Filoni, directing episodes. So yeah, they've shown what they can do with fan service that's done right, and that actually advances the plot. Jar Jar Abrams does fan service just to push nostalgia. It's like, oh hey yeah, remember this? You liked that before, like it again. Yeah, that's what he does. So then Jar Jar Abrams leaves to go work on other stuff after The Force Awakens because, by his own admission, he's no good at actually finishing stories. He just starts them and leaves them for other people to have to deal with. So then Kennedy decided, well, I didn't like the nostalgia pushing that Jar Jar Abrams relied on, so I'm just going to put in someone who's never really directed a major movie before. I'm going to get Roundhead Ruin Johnson, a boy who hates Star Wars, who hates his audience, who is actually on record in interviews saying, you know, my idea of a movie that I like is where half the audience gets up and leaves in disgust, which is, you know, the approach he took with Brick and Looper to his two previous movies before doing The Last Jedi. And The Force Awakens wasn't even finished shooting when he started writing the screenplay for The Last Jedi. And of course, he completely disregarded whatever plan may have been left behind. There's conflicting toss him under the bus reports that, you know, Jar Jar Abrams had a plan that he left behind for Ruin Johnson to follow and that he tossed it in the trash. Other reports say that there was never a plan in the first place except to churn out movies. So yeah. Then there's, you know, and of course, The Last Jedi was nothing but one big insult. It had side quests by minor characters that led nowhere, that were pointless, that, you know, again, the political messaging was ham-handed. It talked down to you. It assumed that you were stupid. And, you know, so naturally, yeah, a lot of people did hate Rose Tico because she was a shallow, one-dimensional concept masquerading as a character. No real development. And then, of course, you know, she's all hot to free these space horses, but then she leaves the kids behind to remain enslaved, like actual children, like sentient species children who are enslaved. They get left behind. So she doesn't give a shit about them. I mean, if she were truly, you know, progressive or liberal, she wouldn't have stopped at freeing the animals. She would have freed the child slaves too. But no, she leaves them behind on Canto Bight to suffer whatever backlash the rich assholes there would take out on them because, yeah. So, but yeah, you know, there's your fake wokeness there. So, you know, so obviously The Last Jedi polarized fans a great deal. Made roughly half as much as The Force Awakens did at the box office, but probably cost about as much because it's over 2.5 hours worth of movie, and you don't you don't make that kind of thing by not spending tons of money. So I mean, with the money it costs to make that thing. In fact, actually, if you go over to World Class Bullshitters, they actually have this chart that shows, you know, the dynamics of how much Disney needs to make on each movie in order to turn a profit on its investment in the Lucasfilm purchase. Because they, like I said, they shelled out over $4 billion to George Lucas to acquire Lucasfilm and Industrial Light and Magic and Star Wars and all these other properties owned by Lucasfilm. And they need each movie to make a minimum of $659 million in profits. And if you're not making that much money in profits, guess what? You're not going to be able to pay for that theme park, Galaxy's Edge, which is largely deserted because the only thing it has going for it is the life-size replica of the Millennium Falcon, and that's about it. It's not worth the inflated ticket price, and so people are staying away. They have no interest in going to see an attraction that only has one or two points of interest and nothing else. So yeah, Galaxy's Edge is a failure, and that has largely to do with The Last Jedi being so divisive and Disney being so heavy-handed trying to recover its investment, where they will overcharge and think that you're stupid enough that you'll pay for it. So after all this, and after Solo, a Star Wars story, lost money at the box office, the first to ever do so, because Kathleen Kennedy decided, oh well, the two directors are shooting stuff that has nothing we can use for what we want, and their lead actor can't act. They had to have an acting coach come on and hold his hand throughout the entire production. So you know what, you guys are fired. Replaced them with Ron Howard, who is a talented director in his own right. Don't get me wrong. He's incredibly talented. He directed Willow. He directed he directed Philadelphia. He directed Apollo 13. He's directed the Da Vinci Code movies with Tom Hanks. So, he's very good as a storyteller. He knows how to direct. He knows how to write. He knows how to tell a story that makes sense. And, but the problem is with Solo was they ended up making one movie for the price of two, because most of the footage that was shot by the previous directors didn't even make it into the final cut. So essentially they had to almost completely remake the movie. And at that point, if you have to essentially remake the entire movie because most of what you shot is unusable, well, you might as well just replace the lead actor, because why pay someone who can't even do the job adequately when you've got Anthony Ingruber, who looks and sounds like Harrison Ford, a young Harrison Ford, and actually nailed it in his own homemade audition video. He nailed it. You could have hired him. He's actually played a young Harrison Ford on another movie, but no, they didn't hire him. They stayed with Aaron Rettenbacher. Ehrenberg, however you pronounce his name, but they chose to stick with him. So he couldn't sell the movie because he couldn't act. And then they decided, oh, well, we're going to have Donald Glover playing a young Lando Calrissian. Oh, well, we're going to make him pansexual so we can pander to LGBT people. And of course, we're going to make him, much more Afrocentric than Billy D. Williams portrayed in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, because reasons. People don't like being pandered to, and when you fundamentally alter a character like Lando Calrissian just to try and pander to a demographic that probably wasn't even interested in that to begin with, because they didn't see Lando Calrissian as someone who necessarily needed to represent them. But again, corporate politics, they have to sell to target demographics. That's part of the target demographic that they're trying to appeal to. So they shoehorn that in and kind of destroyed Lando Calrissian as a character. But here's the thing. And if you notice from The Force Awakens, when Finn, played by John Boyega, turns on his fellow stormtroopers and joins Poe, he doesn't have a name. He's got a serial number. And so, Poe, he doesn't want to call him by a serial number, so why don't we just, your serial number's FN something or other, well, we'll just call you Finn. And he says, oh yeah, Finn's a good name, yeah, right. So they do the same thing with Han Solo in his standalone movie. He doesn't have a last name, well, we'll give you one, you're here solo, so we'll just call you Han Solo. That was completely stupid and contrived. You didn't need a reason to give him the name Han Solo. That's just one of the many problems. So, if someone like Ron Howard, who, again, he's got an incredible talent in his own right, but if he couldn't save Solo, things were bad. Okay? Because a director of his caliber can only do so much with what he has to work with. And it's interesting that, people are not blaming Ron Howard for the failure of Solo. They're blaming Kathleen Kennedy and Disney for interfering in the production and making wrong hiring choices where, there's chaos behind the scenes and rumor mills are coming out from insiders who are, people presumably loyal to George Lucas who are fed up with Kennedy and, her management of the studio. So, yeah, they're going ahead and leaking all this info, just to kind of warn people, look, this is what's going on. You need to pay attention. And so far, all the leaks about The Rise of Skywalker have proven true. That that they were shooting all the way up practically to the last minute, right before the deadline to make their December 20th release date. Because if they'd had to push it back, that would have been, publicly embarrassing. So rather than push back the release date to next year, they decided, no, they had to stick to that after The Last Jedi. So you would think that after The Last Jedi being so divisive, that they would bring in someone who actually has talent to try and retcon The Last Jedi and fix what Ruin Johnson broke. But no, they brought back Jar Jar Abrams. Again, the worst possible choice to go ahead and try and fix what Ruin Johnson broke, because he made the conscious decision to double down. So we see Billy D. Williams thrown in as Lando Calrissian for no real narrative reason other than to have him in there. It's like, yeah, you remember Lando Calrissian. You liked him in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. Well, he's back. Like him again. We give him nothing to do, but like him. He's in here. It's like, oh, you remember Palpatine. You liked him as a big bad in the original trilogy. Well, accept him again. Because Ruin Johnson killed off Snoke. Supposedly the bigger, badder version of Palpatine, who is the new big bad with mysterious origins. But rather than try and retcon what Ruin Johnson did, because Ruin Johnson basically said, oh, Snoke is nobody, he's not important. Fuck him and fuck you for even thinking that you could come up with... because Ruin Johnson, he loves to troll people on Twitter. He posted this picture with a little card saying all your Snoke fan theories suck. Because that's the kind of troll he is. He loves to troll people and toss out insults and act like a child, because he is a child. I mean, Ruin Johnson and Jar Jar Abrams and Kathleen Kennedy and Bob Iger, these four are all overgrown children. And they treat us adults like children. They talk down to us. They insult us when we react negatively. Because you know what? Human beings react negatively to insult. You can take your passive aggression and shove it up your ass. Passive aggression is still aggression. Passive aggression is used by narcissists to attack you as a person, as an individual, or as a group. And then when you react to aggression, because again, passive aggression is still aggression, and people react negatively to aggression, whether it's passive or active. They react strongly, they react negatively. And so when you get that inevitable negative reaction to that passive aggression, then the narcissists, act all wounded, and it's, oh, you're attacking us, you're misogynist, racist man babies, living in your parents' basement or whatever. You're the reason why the movies have failed. It's not us, it's not our ideas. We had the bestest ideas ever. We're too clever to use traditional storytelling tools. We're just going to do bad fan fiction. No, actually, no. It's not even fan fiction, because fan fiction is written by fans. People who actually love the material they're writing their fiction for. And these people are not fans. They actually despise the original source material that they're working with. Jar Jar Abrams. I don't. If you ever attend a panel where you've got someone like, say, Martin Scorsese or Peter Weller or Mark Hamill or George Lucas, you practically cannot get them to shut up about all the movies and TV shows and other influences that they loved that made it into their films. You can't get them to stop talking about this stuff. Jar Jar Abrams, if you ever attend a panel that he's on, does he even talk about anything that has influenced him? If he does, how does he discuss it? Because I get the impression that this boy doesn't even like movies or television. I don't think he even likes visual media. I don't think he reads. I mean, he knows how to, but I don't think he even... if he has any kind of library of books at all, it's probably a lot of stuff that's shallow and one-dimensional, or if there is anything of substance, he's never actually read it. He just has it on there on his shelf to look good, but he doesn't actually read it. He doesn't know anything about what's between the covers. He couldn't tell you anything about the contents because he doesn't actually read it. And when it comes to film and television, you can tell he doesn't... I mean, this is a boy who actually went on Jon Stewart's show, the Daily Show with Jon Stewart, in 2009, promoting his Star Trek reboot, and said, I didn't like Star Trek. I thought it was too cerebral. So the implication is that he's too dumb to appreciate Star Trek, which has been described as Wagon Train to the Stars. I mean, yeah, it's a science fiction, but it's Wagon Train to the Stars. How deep is it going to be? So, but if he thinks that's too cerebral, so basically he's saying that he had to dumb Star Trek down to his level before he could make a movie that he would be satisfied with. And again, the Star Trek reboot and Into Darkness, its immediate follow-up, breakneck pacing, so because again, you can't be allowed to stop and think about what you're seeing, because if you had to stop and think, you would realize you're being insulted and you would walk out. So you can't give the audience time to think about anything. Just look, just relax, react. Oh yeah, you liked Khan in the first Star Trek 2. Well, like him again, but we're going to put a twist on it. Instead of having him be portrayed by a Mexican to play an East Indian character, you're in Redface. He's played by a British guy who doesn't even bother to hide his Britishness. And then you have this plot contrivance where, yeah, he had surgery to alter his appearance because reasons. And so then when he says, my name is Khan, and it comes off sounding stupid because, again, the audience is being sold a product based on nostalgia pushing. And so, but it's also marketed to people who don't like Star Trek, don't care about Star Trek, probably never saw an episode of Star Trek like Jar Jar Abrams, except maybe, a 5-minute compilation video or something. But, it's like, if you're someone who's never seen a Star Trek movie before, or seen an episode of the original series, and you're walking in here and it's like, why is Benedict Cumberbatch talking like that? Because I have no idea who Khan is. Or what that's in reference to. Jar Jar Abrams it hopes, as a storyteller, he desperately hopes that nostalgia alone will get you to come into the movie theater and stick around long enough to accept whatever insult he throws to your intelligence. So why is it any surprise that he would do the same thing with The Force Awakens, or that he would triple down on all of that with The Rise of Skywalker, where you completely destroy everything that people loved about the original trilogies and nostalgia push? So yeah, never mind that Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber got broken in The Last Jedi. Well, it's back here without any explanation. So yeah, we'll just give you that back. And also, yeah, here's Leia's lightsaber, even though Abrams seems to have forgotten that he established that Leia never finished her training and so presumably never had a lightsaber. But no, Luke's Force Ghost appears and hands Daisy Ridley's Rey Leia's lightsaber, even though there's no reason she should have one. But because the plot demands it, it's there. Don't stop to think about how or why it's there. Just accept it and move on. So here's the thing. In the prequel trilogies, Palpatine spent the better part of 20 years setting himself up to slowly insinuate himself into power. Okay, he orchestrates the trade war between the Trade Federation and the Naboo, and uses the fallout from that to maneuver himself into a no confidence vote in Chancellor Valorum, played by Terrence Stamp, who was in Superman 2. Terrific actor, by the way. So, he orchestrates events so that he can become Chancellor. And then he orchestrates events further 10 years down the line, where he has gone ahead and started the Clone Wars to weaken the Jedi, have them chasing after enemies and phantoms, while he consolidates all these powers and manipulates events so that he can gain the powers of an emperor before he's even emperor himself, so that by the time we get to Revenge of the Sith, he can finally drop all pretenses and create the Galactic Empire out of the collapse of the Old Republic and destroy the Jedi. This is a guy who plays the long game, and his defeat at the end of Return of the Jedi, comes from hubris. He has spent so long succeeding in his machinations and is so overconfident in his own abilities that he doesn't stop to think, except for maybe a brief momentary suspicion that maybe Darth Vader might be unreliable, but he's overconfident and thinks that he can foil whatever the others have planned. So he doesn't really see Darth Vader's betrayal coming, and he's basically defeats himself. So what happens in The Rise of Skywalker? He comes out of nowhere and announces his presence to try and manipulate Kylo Ren to bring him his granddaughter. And again, we got no foreshadowing in any of the previous two movies that Rey was a Palpatine. Palpatine was only brought back for A Rise of Skywalker because Rian Johnson killed off Snoke, and Jar Jar Abrams, being the no-talent hack he is, could not see a way to resurrect Snoke that people would accept. And so, he went back to George Lucas and said, help, I need some advice. What do I do here? And supposedly, again, I cannot confirm this, but supposedly George Lucas recommended, okay, well, why don't you bring back Palpatine? I don't know, maybe he was trying to sabotage Abrams, because let's face it, George Lucas hated The Force Awakens and he despised The Last Jedi. And he was conspicuously absent for the premiere of The Rise of Skywalker. The one on Monday where it played to the media shills who almost universally hate it because it doesn't destroy Star Wars the way that they wanted it to be destroyed. Because the shills who love The Last Jedi for destroying Luke Skywalker and making him a coward who hides out on this planet and refuses to join the fight, and instead of physically going to Not Hoth to fight Kylo Ren, he force projects himself and dies of exhaustion like a bitch. Yeah, that's what they did. So apparently, because Jar Jar Abrams tried to retcon, basically the media shows who love The Last Jedi and hate The Rise of Skywalker, their only bitch is that Jar Jar Abrams didn't do what Rian Johnson did. All the things that they hate, and this is why they're stupid, okay? the media shows who sing the praises of The Last Jedi as taking bold moves and challenging the audience. No, no, it didn't challenge the audience. It insulted the audience. It told the audience to go fuck itself. It said, ha ha ha, you're scum for even thinking that there would be any payoff to the answers that Jar Jar Abrams set up. And fuck you. And for some reason, the media shows, get down and verbally fillet Ruin Johnson for this shit. But all the things that they loved The Last Jedi for, they hate in The Rise of Skywalker, because Jar Jar Abrams is also destroying the legacy of the Skywalkers. He turned Rey into a secret Palpatine. Yeah, no explanation for how Palpatine could have had children between... because there was never any hint, either in the original trilogy or in the prequel trilogy, that he had children. But supposedly he has a son who then goes on to father Rey, and apparently now in The Rise of Skywalker it's established that Luke and Leia knew she was a Palpatine, and that she was left, and that her parents left her on Jakku to protect her from her grandfather. After Ruin Johnson said, oh yeah, she's nobody, her parents were nobodies, they sold her for drinking money, and then died. But apparently, this was Jar Jar Abrams' attempt to retcon that and get Rey, because he hinted that Rey was important, okay? And I think people would have accepted that Rey had been a student of Luke Skywalker and had some training, but because, Kylo Ren had turned to the dark side, he had to hide his surviving students on different planets, much like Luke was hidden on Tatooine and Leia was hidden in the royal family on Alderaan. You could have, if you're going to rehash anything, you could have done it where Rey was, secretly maybe one of Luke's students and maybe potentially the most powerful one, but, not yet fully trained, but she had some training. And I suspect that's what Jar Jar Abrams originally intended, but then Ruin Johnson went ahead and tossed that out the window and said she was nobody. And because Disney can't go ahead and retcon this adequately without undermining The Last Jedi and looking like they don't know what they're doing, even though it's obvious they don't know what they're doing, but nobody wants to admit that. But there's this attempt to retcon it so that, yeah, she was secretly a Palpatine, and that's what, and she's got this Force link with Kylo Ren, and that's how she's gaining all this knowledge that she shouldn't even have, and but it's just so stupid. And then of course, so Palpatine in the new movie, apparently he announces his presence at the beginning of the movie, that he's got this fleet of super star destroyers, each one with the ability to destroy a planet, just like the Death Star, because apparently the Death Star, its problem was that it was only one immense battle station, and Starkiller Base was only one immense planet battle station, and therefore vulnerable, because if it can be destroyed, well, then you have to start all over, and it takes decades to build a new one. So why not just build a whole fleet of super star destroyers, each with the ability of the Death Star to destroy a planet? Never mind that the energy requirements needed to destroy a planet cannot be contained in a mere spaceship. You had to have something as large as a planet itself in order to have that kind of power output. So yeah, Jar Jar Abrams clearly doesn't know what the hell he's doing, so he's just tossing things onto the screen and hoping that people will accept it. And, again, breakneck pacing, don't take any time to think, move on to the next scene. Yeah, so, he's just throwing stuff out there hoping something will stick, and it comes across like that. And, of course, Palpatine... supposedly, even though basically he's trapped in his own corpse, which again, again, this is why Jar Jar Abrams is stupid, but he thinks we're stupid, because we clearly saw Those of us who saw it in the movie theaters back in 1983, and even the special editions, although I'm sure Disney will try to retcon this by further edits, but we've already seen the Death Star blows up, the second Death Star blows up so completely in orbit around Endor. There are no pieces large enough. Certainly not the throne room, not any other part, but there certainly are no pieces large enough to survive entry into the atmosphere. So Palpatine, who was thrown down a ventilation shaft by Darth Vader, and we very clearly see his body explode in Return of the Jedi as he's falling down this reactor shaft. And then, of course, the Death Star itself is disintegrated in orbit, so there shouldn't even be enough pieces left to raise out of the Endor Ocean. And yet, again, thrown in there just to have it in there. Oh yeah, you remember the Death Star throne room scene from Return of the Jedi? Well, here it's back. Nostalgia pushing just to sell the movie. Never mind that it makes no sense, that it's insulting to the audience who knows it shouldn't be there. But it's back. Palpatine is back, even though, again, he shouldn't even have a body. And the Palpatine makeup they used for Ian McDiarmid looks nothing like in Return of the Jedi or in Revenge of the Sith. Nope. Just looks like a corpse hooked up to life support machinery to keep the brain active, I guess. And for some reason, Palpatine wants Rey to kill him so that he can transfer his Force essence into her and, come alive again. But then, apparently, Force healing is now an ability that's pulled out of the ass and Force healing as a concept itself isn't necessarily a bad idea. But we've never actually seen it before in Star Wars. I mean, you could have put it in something like, say, The Force Awakens, just to kind of, or maybe even in the Clone Wars animated show, or something before The Force Awakens to kind of hint that, yeah, this is something that can be done with, proper training or people who have that specific Force talent. Well, and maybe some do and some don't. You could have developed that before. Here it's just shoehorned in because the plot requires it. And so when Palpatine is somehow able to absorb the essence of all the Sith who ever lived before and come alive again fully, so he's alive again in his body instead of his mind being trapped in this corpse, then he realizes he doesn't need Rey, so he tries to kill Rey and Kylo and drain their life energy. And he tosses Kylo into this crevice and, tries to Force lightning Rey. He uses Force lightning to obliterate the Rebel fleet above. But somehow Rey is able to take a single lightsaber to block it and then use two lightsabers to push his own Force lightning back at him. And for some reason, he still has not learned, turn off your Force lightning abilities, when your enemies turn it back on you. We're expected to believe that for all he's supposedly clever, but he's still too stupid to learn even that lesson. So he gets disintegrated by Rey because she's the bestest ever, because now she's all the Jedi. But the effort kills her, and then Kylo Ren comes along and uses the same technique that Palpatine did to transfer his life essence into her and revive her. And then he dies, and they kiss before he dies, which, I mean, it's just all these stupid decisions. And of course, the scene with the space horses running on the surface of the ship. First of all, they're doing this in space with only respirator masks to protect them from the vacuum of space. You're in space. What happens if you were thrown out into space without a spacesuit? Well, if you don't immediately freeze into a solid chunk of ice, the radiation from whatever star you're closest to will kill you. within seconds. But somehow we're supposed to believe that these space horses and people who are riding with just, oxygen masks and nothing else to protect them from the vacuum of space can somehow ride on the surface of a ship because, I don't know, maybe the ship's got an atmosphere surrounding it. We don't know. It's never established that this is possible. But don't stop to think about it. Just accept it and move on because it looks cool. And rumor had it that one test screening had audiences leaving when the Millennium Falcon and everyone on it is destroyed. But here, Jar Jar Abrams set up Finn and Poe as, Poe as a replacement for Han Solo, and Finn as someone with a story arc of his own. But again, they're treated as side quest characters who serve no purpose in the movie because it's all about Rey now. So the side quest with the Finn and Poe, and it's just basically there to pad out the running time. This is what Star Wars has been reduced to: a shameless marketing gimmick designed to sell you the crap that the Magic Store couldn't give away, and is being sold as $50 worth of magic for $15 when it's actually probably $5 worth of magic and you've overpaid. And by the time you realize the con, oh, sorry, no refunds. If this were to take place in an actual magic store, if it had, and at least an actual magic store has actual magic stuff in it, and it's actually the good stuff, the high quality stuff. That Magic Mystery Box is just, trying to move this stuff that wasn't selling, and so you can make room for the stuff that will sell. But with Jar Jar Abrams, the only thing he has is that Magic Mystery Box. And if you are running a magic store that has only Magic Mystery Boxes, only the cheap shit that people wouldn't buy if it wasn't in that mystery box, well, you'd be out of business fairly quickly because word of mouth would spread that all you sell is junk that is packaged and overpriced, and people wouldn't buy from you anymore. Well, you know what? I hope that actually happens here. I hope The Rise of Skywalker flops so badly that it ends Jar Jar Abrams' career forever in Hollywood. I want Ruin Johnson to never again work in Hollywood. I want Kathleen Kennedy to never again work in Hollywood. I want Bob Iger to never again work in Hollywood. I want his presidential ambitions to crash and burn. I want this thing to flop so badly that no one, absolutely no one, would ever trust this idiot to run the country because it shows that he doesn't even fucking know how to run Disney. The only reason Marvel is even successful is because of Kevin Feige. Because unlike Bob Iger and unlike Kathleen Kennedy, Kevin Feige actually knows how to tell a story. He knows how to create a planned story arc that has a definite beginning, middle, and end. A mind like that, you see that with George Lucas, you see it with Kevin Feige, but that's actually surprisingly rare. And the only reason that Disney is succeeding there with Marvel is because of Kevin Feige. If Kevin Feige were to leave, if he went over to say, let's say Kathleen Kennedy somehow won out in this battle behind the scenes and solidified her position and forced Kevin Feige out for whatever reason, it's not likely to happen given how Star Wars has failed under Kathleen Kennedy's watch. But let's just say for the sake of argument, Kevin Feige decides to leave Disney and Marvel and go over to, say, DC, or maybe start his own company. Do you really think Disney would last? No. Bob Iger would be out just like Michael Eisner was eventually pushed out. because he brought Disney to a point where uh, it just was not profitable anymore. And a lot of the decisions that he made, that were questionable. Things he did with Jeffrey Katzenberg that, kind of stole people. Basically, they fucked over Robin Williams. If you're not familiar with that, when he agreed to do the voice of the genie for Aladdin, he stipulated in his contract, look, don't let people know that I'm the voice of the genie because I want the kids to be surprised. I don't want this. I don't want to be used to sell toys or to sell the movie. I want them to be surprised and sell the movie on its own merits. Okay, but Disney went ahead and broke that contract by revealing in the poster that the genie was played by Robin Williams because it made him look a bit like Robin Williams, and it was possible not to make the connection. And the trailers, of course, had the genie's voiced by Robin Williams, and so so they screwed him over. And Robin Williams really only came back because by the time they did Aladdin 3, the people who had screwed him over were gone. But the whole reason he wasn't back for Aladdin 2, The Return of Jafar, was because he was still pissed at Disney. He didn't want to come back for it, so they had to get Dan Castellaneta, the voice of Homer Simpson, to play the genie. But yeah, I mean, so Disney was not doing too well by the time Bob Iger took over. But then Bob Iger, he's been turning Disney into a trust. Okay, he's been gobbling up properties like Marvel, like Fox, like trying to buy out all these different companies and make Disney the only entertainment company anywhere. Now, if I was president, I would be enforcing antitrust laws and getting more passed by Congress, and I would break up Disney. I would force them to sell off Fox. I would force them to sell off Marvel and all these other properties. I would force them to sell off Pixar. Because, any one company, when it becomes so large and so unmanageable that it ends up destroying the properties it acquires, you really don't want it to keep doing that. And personally, if I were Bob Iger, if I were in his position, I would have fired Kathleen Kennedy the moment Solo lost money at the box office. And have said, look, you're gone. I'm putting in Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni. They're going to take over and try and fix this. I mean, hell, I would have fired her after the Last Jedi. In fact, I probably would have fired her after The Force Awakens, just because The Force Awakens was utter garbage. And I probably would have put in Favreau or Filoni or even Ron Howard to take over and do the Last Jedi or whatever second movie, because I would not have killed off Luke Skywalker. And I sure as hell wouldn't have turned Carrie Fisher into Mary Poppins in space. But, here's the thing. And this is another thing that Jar Jar Abrams to destroy Carrie Fisher and Leia in The Rise of Skywalker is because Carrie Fisher died from a drug-induced heart attack after she filmed her scenes for The Last Jedi. So Jar Jar Abrams took unused footage from The Force Awakens and shoehorned that into The Rise of Skywalker just to have Leia in there. I mean, you could have had her die off screen or something, but no, he had to recycle that unused footage because reasons. And so basically scenes are shot around that unused footage. When they show her from behind, they have a stand-in for Carrie Fisher as Leia so that it looks like she's in the scene with the other rebels. But it's shot badly. I mean, it's like she's complete. it's like Leia is completely detached from the action within the movie, and it's because because you're shoehorning in footage of someone who's dead and couldn't shoot these scenes and react to what other people are saying. And so, and the editing is so bad that it just is not possible to believe that she's in the action. And so, these are things that break suspension of disbelief, just like in The Force Awakens, where you see where people see the beam, the death beam shot out from Starkiller Base, shooting across the sky to destroy uh, the New Republic planets. There's no way you would be able to see that from a planet when this beam is presumably millions of miles away, and you're seeing it in the daytime. I mean, that breaks suspension of disbelief. It is just utter garbage. So I mean, so yeah, I mean, Star Wars, except for the Mandalorian, Star Wars is basically dead. There is no, I cannot see any way that Star Wars can recover from this. Yeah, Kathleen Kennedy basically being a yes woman and sucking up to Bob Iger and doing what he wanted, but at the expense of hiring directors and writers who have nothing but contempt for Star Wars and who only try to milk what worked about it as a selling point, and they don't actually do anything with it. They made the extended universe, which people actually like, non-canonical, so they're not using that, even though Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau are borrowing elements from it for The Mandalorian. So who knows if it's actually set in the extended universe or in the big screen universe? We don't know. But on the big screen, I think Star Wars is dead. I think after the way they shat all over George Lucas's legacy, shat all over his most successful films, because he had directed movies before and after Star Wars. He directed American Graffiti. He directed THX 1138. He directed some kind of a World War II movie after the prequels. I don't remember the name, but it was pretty forgettable though, and I think that kind of showed that the fire has kind of gone out as far as his ability to tell a non-Star Wars story. But yeah, I mean, I don't see how it can recover from this, because I don't see how this movie makes any money. The critics hate it, audiences are hating it. Every review I've seen so far has been negative. I mean, these people have completely pissed off every possible target demographic for Star Wars. But fans of the original two trilogies, they've pissed them off and alienated them. They've alienated even the people they're supposedly marketing this to, because they don't like being pandered to. So I don't know how Star Wars can recover. I mean, because supposedly, and again, I have nothing to base this on except what I've heard on Midnight's Edge. But supposedly, all the reshoots, because test screenings, proved to be so unpopular that people walked out from them, and of course, Jar Jar Abrams and others are saying, "Oh, there were no test screenings; we just had family and friends." But I don't buy that. Jar Jar Abrams is a liar. But even if what he says is true, but the leaks had it where people walked out of test screenings because they were so pissed off by what was originally shot, that they had to do reshoots and more reshoots and more reshoots on top of that. That gets expensive. That drives up the cost of actually making the movie, because you essentially, again, just as with Solo, you essentially have to remake the entire movie. So you're making one movie for the price of two and driving up the cost. And people tend to ignore or forget that it's not just the production cost that matters. You also have to take into account marketing and merchandising. and distribution fees because theaters want their cut. The cost of advertising, getting TV spots and internet ads and newspaper ads and magazine ads and all that, posters at theaters and all these costs that you don't know about. I would not be surprised if this movie had a budget of at least $500 million. It's probably in the $500 million range because the reshoots themselves are rumored to have cost at least $200 million on top of a production budget, an initial production budget that was probably in the ballpark of between $200 and $300 million. So yeah, I mean, I would not be surprised if the total budget for this thing ended up being $500 million. If it doesn't make $1 billion to recover the costs, then this movie will lose money, just like Solo did. I don't think it's going to clear $1 billion. I really don't. People are so angry that even the Rotten Tomatoes score is below 60%. It's hovering between 50 and 60%. And this is December 20th. There were the early, because the screenings on Monday were for the press, so that the critics could review it and recommend the movie to you and say, oh yeah, it's great, go see it. It's a wonderful end to the Skywalker saga. It does it all justice. No, the critics almost universally hate it. And they're telling you it's bad, genuinely awful. Media shills from Matt Goldberg over at Collider to Scott Mendelson over at Forbes to even John Campea, who loved The Last Jedi, apparently. They hate it. They don't like it. They're saying this is a bad movie, a genuinely bad movie, uninspired, overdoes it with the nostalgia pushing. It's too fast paced because the pacing is obviously meant to prevent you from digesting anything and thinking about what you've seen, because they know that if you stop to think, you would get angry and walk out before the movie's even over. You would probably demand a refund. And I couldn't blame you if you paid money to see this and then demanded a refund. But, I suspect that the only reason people are going to see this is, to review for their YouTube channels, but they're not even paying for it. They're getting friends to sneak them in, and or they're going with people who have spent money and they're not actually spending the tickets on themselves. But I suspect that no one's going to want to go back for repeat viewings. And that's actually how a lot of movies, like, say, the Marvel movies, have generated such intense profits, because people are going back to see it a second, a third, a fourth time. They're bringing their family and friends to see it with them on later showings. I went to see Joker twice this year because it was such a great film that I wanted to go back and see it on a second viewing and try and catch the things that I missed in the first showing. So yeah, repeat viewings actually do help drive up. That's why Gone with the Wind is still the highest grossing film of all time. When you account for inflation, it has made in excess of $3 billion. And this is why, in my previous video on the subject, I pointed out how when you adjust for inflation, the price, the actual profit goes up, because adjusted for inflation, Gone with the Wind, multiple theatrical releases, yeah, well over $3 billion. And that's why Avengers Endgame, no, has not topped Avatar. It has not topped Titanic. It is not the highest grossing movie of all time because of inflation. And yet Disney put out the spin, oh yeah, it beat Avatar, and it's now the highest grossing movie. No, it's not, because you're not accounting for inflation. You're not accounting for the profit margin because of how much was spent actually making and marketing and distributing the movie. Its profit level is not as high as Disney would have you believe. which is why Joker is actually now the highest grossing R-rated movie of all time, since we had the R rating introduced, because it had a production budget of like 50 to 60 million dollars, and its marketing and distribution budget was probably roughly about the same, probably between 40 and 60 million dollars, because they wanted people to see this movie. So it's made over $1 billion at the global box office on a total production budget of probably between 100 and 120 million dollars. That is significant profit. It is wildly successful. But this movie, Star Wars: The Rise of Palpatine, because that's what it really is. Rey is a secret Palpatine, according to Jar Jar Abrams, and therefore it's the rise of Palpatine usurping the Skywalker name because she turns against her grandfather, who is shoehorned back in because Abrams couldn't figure out a clever way to bring Snoke back. Oh, and it turns out Snoke was basically a clone, basically part of an army of clones, basically serving as meat puppets for Palpatine to speak through to seduce Kylo Ren to the dark side. Because apparently he's been using the Force to communicate telepathically with Kylo Ren, and using the voice of Darth Vader and Snoke and all these other voices apparently to of Sith from the past to try and fool him and turn him to the dark side. Yeah, contrivance after contrivance after contrivance, all of it just insulting and utterly garbage. It is utter trash. I linked to in one of my previous two movies. Shad over at Shadiversity goes scene by scene what happens in The Rise of Skywalker and why it is utter trash, and all the contrivances at Jar Jar Abrams. Because Shad despised The Force Awakens and he loathes The Last Jedi, and of course he likes to do stuff on medieval history and sword fighting and arms and armor, and he's rightly called out the piss poor fight choreography in the Disney trilogy, because it's obvious that nobody at any point decided, well, maybe we should make the fight scenes actually look plausible, because Daisy Ridley doesn't know how to wield a sword, and it shows. The fight scene in the throne room in The Last Jedi was so badly choreographed that people couldn't get into it. They couldn't believe it, because it was just so awful. I mean, at least with Revenge of the Sith, the final lightsaber duel between Anakin and Obi-Wan, comes across as pretty decent. There's still some stuff in there to criticize, but it's still obvious that there was a fight choreographer there, and that whatever wasn't realistic was a creative choice to make it look better. But they still had an honest to goodness fight choreographer, someone who actually taught these guys how to fight with lightsabers, because the stunt sabers that they used, they're a lot more durable than they were in the original trilogy. Because the original trilogy, you basically had this like rotating stick attached to the handle with these reflectors attached to the stick, and that way when you showed light on it, the reflectors would bounce it back, and it would, and that's how they did it. And for the prequel trilogy, the lightsabers were actually professionally made with Graflex blades that light up, and then you go ahead and use Adobe After Effects to go ahead and make it look all glowy and everything. But that those were designed for combat use, So I mean, you probably went through lightsaber blades, because they would break or whatever, but they were sturdy enough that you could actually spar with them, and that's why you can see people using them with one hand instead of two, like in the original trilogy, because they were a lot more delicate, and you had to be a lot more careful with your fight choreography, and so you wouldn't break them because you only had so many to work with. But also because, again, being designed after katanas, and katanas are two-handed weapons. So, and so you're taught how to wield it like you would a katana, which is, which does require two hands. So, but Yeah, so I mean, it's just the movie is trash, and like I said, I just cannot see this thing breaking a billion because after the Last Jedi and Solo, the Last Jedi made roughly half as much as the Force Awakens. Now, the Force Awakens came close, but not did not quite reach the original Star Wars' inflation-adjusted box office totals. So, because it was like over $2 billion, and when you adjust for inflation, the original Star Wars still tops The Force Awakens. The Last Jedi only made over $1 billion, roughly half as much as The Force Awakens. Solo lost money at the box office, and Rogue One, which was an immediate prequel to A New Hope, that actually kind of leads directly into it, made roughly about $1 billion or so, but I think it had a lower budget too. So Solo lost money at the box office. I think this movie is going to lose money at the box office. I really do. I think that this movie basically kills Star Wars going forward unless Kevin Feige or Jon Favreau step in and take Kathleen Kennedy's place. Because as long as she's in charge, even if it's only on paper, even if the rumors are true and she's only there as a figurehead and Bob Iger's running everything, but Bob Iger, if he's actually the one running things and Kathleen Kennedy is sidelined, this just shows that he is incapable of running Star Wars. So unless you put in a real talent like Kevin Feige or Jon Favreau, I don't see how Star Wars can recover from this. I think it's dead. Again, you have all these influences going into the original trilogy, from Flash Gordon to World War II and dogfightings to John Ford westerns to Akira Kurosawa to Lord of the Rings to real world events like the McCarthy hearings and Vietnam. All these influences that went into the original Star Wars and made it so well loved, they're gone from the Disney trilogy. What we're seeing is the empty shell of Star Wars after it's been hollowed out and turned into just another lifeless toy to be sold on a toy store shelf. But nobody's buying those toys. None of the toys or any merchandise from the Disney trilogy is selling. It's all stuff based on the original trilogies. The original and then the prequels. That's the merchandise people are buying. They're not buying crap based on the Disney trilogy. So unless there's, a major change of hands, because, I think Disney might end up, I don't know, I don't want to say that Bob Iger will be forced to sell Lucasfilm off and write it off as a loss. I don't think Disney is that stupid. I think they're stubborn. Bob Iger is certainly stubborn. He's not going to want to admit that he failed and that he presided over the destruction of Lucasfilm and everything that went with it. So I don't think Disney's going to give that up. I think what they're going to do is they're going to give this a rest for a few years and try and ride on shows like The Mandalorian for Disney Plus, which is actually worth paying for. If you don't want to give Disney your money, I'm sure you can find alternate ways to watch the show. But The Mandalorian right now is the closest thing we have to Star Wars right now. And it's being handled by people who actually love the original material, who know how to tell good stories, and get people to watch and come back for more because, you fall in love with the characters, you fall in love with the story, and you want to see it through to its conclusion, whatever that conclusion might be. So, they actually know what they're doing. But unless Star Wars is handed over to people like them, or someone who actually cares about Star Wars, I don't think you're going to see it on the big screen again for quite a while. the actors from the Disney trilogy, Daisy Ridley, John Boyega, Oscar Isaac, they've said in interviews they're done. They're moving on after this. They're not returning. And no, Ruin Johnson is not going to get his trilogy. He can lie all he wants and say, oh, yeah, it's still happening. It's still on. It's going to be the bestest ever. It's going to have nothing to do with the Skywalkers. Because all of the problems inherent in The Rise of Skywalker stem from what he did in The Last Jedi that derailed whatever half-assed plan that Jar Jar Abrams had in place. Because they completely discarded George Lucas's outlines. I mean, I've reported this in other videos. Bob Iger, in his memoir, the one he put out so that he can run for president in 2024, he basically admitted that, yeah, George Lucas gave him these outlines, and he told George Lucas that he would use them, but then tossed them in the trash and had a provision in the contract that said Disney was not contractually obligated to use them, and of course they didn't. They discarded them. So you've got George Lucas pissed off because he feels like he was betrayed by Disney, and he probably feels really betrayed by Kathleen Kennedy, who agreed to go ahead and do whatever Bob Iger told her to do. So yeah, I mean, I don't see Kathleen Kennedy sticking around at Lucasfilm. Her contract got extended till at least 2020 or 2021 after apparently no one else wanted to take the job, because I don't think Disney was going to renew her contract last year. All indications, because after Solo flopped at the box office, what ended up happening was that, rumor was that Kathleen Kennedy was on her way out the door, and that Disney was actually looking for someone to replace her over at Lucasfilm. And they actually did not announce her contract renewal until the last minute. And even when they did announce it, it was almost as an afterthought. It was done quietly so as to ruffle as few feathers as possible. So I don't think they're going to renew her contract after it's up next year or the year after. I think she's gone. I don't think she's actually really in charge, because she went on in this interview recently, a couple weeks ago, saying that there weren't going to be any more trilogies, that any future films would simply be open-ended and whatever. So she said there weren't going to be any more trilogies, and then Bob Iger comes out almost right after and contradicts her and says, no, there's going to be new trilogies. So I don't think that Kathleen Kennedy is even really being kept in the loop. I don't think she even knows what's going on at Lucasfilm anymore. She's not being told anything. She says something, it immediately gets contradicted. So, I mean, she's there on paper. But I don't think she's being allowed to run anything. I think it's all Bob Iger at this point, and even he is fucking it up. That's my suspicion. I cannot prove it. Okay? That's just speculation on my part, based on the things I've seen so far. So if by some chance Ketwalski or some other shill for major media corporations is watching, and you want to go ahead and lie about me and say I'm spreading rumors and disinformation, no, I cannot prove any of this. This is just my own opinion that I'm giving based on the things I've seen so far. Because common sense would dictate that you don't let someone like Kathleen Kennedy, after she's mismanaged probably one of the biggest properties in Disney's portfolio this badly, I don't see how you keep her around unless there's no one else who wants to take the job. But I think with The Mandalorian, because it's already been renewed for a third season, I mean, it's been so successful right now with the first season, and they already are shooting season 2, and they've announced for a third season. At least that's according to what's making the rounds. So, so I think probably what will end up happening, and this is just speculation. I could be wrong. Okay, I could be wrong, but I think what might happen is that Favreau and Filoni might eventually be brought on board with Kevin Feige to take over Lucasfilm on the big screen. Because Feige can only do Marvel for so long, all right? Phase 4 is already in the works, and that's probably going to be... he's probably going to hand the reins off at some point, because there's only so long that you can take the Marvel stories. I mean, they still have the X-Men and Fantastic Four, because those are now back in Marvel hands, but it's going to take years to develop those into something that MCU can actually use. Because New Mutants, the release date keeps getting pushed back, and that was made before the sale of Fox Entertainment's division to Disney. But supposedly it's so awful that if Disney releases it at all, it'll probably be in and out of theaters real quick. But it's something that Disney is basically taking stock of what they've got from Fox, and they're going to... I mean, they will bring the X-Men and Fantastic Four into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's just going to take time in order to go through what they've got and try to go ahead and make something that's usable. But that's going to be years down the line. And I don't know if Kevin Feige is going to be around for all of that, because after Phase 4... Because really... I think Marvel Cinematic Universe is going to wind down too, because Avengers Endgame was this big epic finale to a story that had been building for something like 12 years, and everything here is going to be anticlimactic. So unless you're willing to build up another great big epic multi-movie spanning story, honestly, I don't know if Kevin Feige has it in him to do another one. The Phase 4 seems to be more like an epilogue, and he'll probably hand over the reins to someone he trusts to continue that over at Marvel, and then maybe they'll bring him in over at Lucasfilm and try and salvage Star Wars. But I don't think this is something that Star Wars can recover from on the big screen. I think it's going to be years, maybe a decade at least, before we see another movie. I really do. Because at this point, it's basically going to depend on opening weekend totals and the second week drop off. Like I said, early reviews by critics, they almost universally hate this movie for the wrong reasons, I think, but that they almost hate it, universally hate it. When Scott Mendelson, who is one of the biggest shills for the Last Jedi, said that it's got shallow video game level plotting, like 8 or 16-bit level video game plotting, shallow concepts masquerading as characters, just uninspired, completely shameless fan service just to get you to go see the movie. I mean, because fan service, there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. It's done a lot more often than you might think. But it has to advance the plot. It has to advance the story, or be worked into a way that is respectful and actually doesn't insult the viewer's intelligence. And if that's all it is just to get you to go see the movie, then it's just pointless. There's no narrative reason for it to be there, and people will reject it. And I think they're rejecting it now, actually. So yeah, we'll see what happens with the opening weekend totals and the second week drop off. Like I said, I think this will, like Solo, end up losing money because the expenses that went into making it were so high that it almost has to do at least $2 billion just to recover the money that was poured into it. Because if it makes under $1 billion, I don't think it's going to I genuinely don't think it's going to make any money in its theatrical run. It'll have to make up for it on streaming services and physical media in order to turn any kind of profit. But the visuals of it, the whole public relations dynamic will be that this was the second Star Wars movie in a row to lose money at the global box office, and basically tarnishes the reputation of Disney and Lucasfilm, and if the perception in the public mind will be that Star Wars is dead and that it's a failure. And so it'll be very difficult to start a new trilogy that tries to do justice to the original or continue things as is, because you've done such disrespect to Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia and Han Solo and Chewbacca and C-3PO and R2-D2 and the actors who portrayed those characters and brought them to life on the big screen. You've disrespected them at every turn. I mean, the one video clip that's been making the rounds in the media, where they've got cast members from The Rise of Skywalker along with Jar Jar Abrams, and they're being asked to react to the movie using only their facial expressions, and they all almost universally look at it like, what the fuck is this shit? And Ian McDermott, poor Ian McDermott, who played Palpatine one last time, says, seriously, this is what happens after, over 40 years of Star Wars. This is how it ends. I mean, come on. I mean, and you can tell, that they're trying to be tongue in cheek about it, but not really. And they're basically saying in no uncertain terms, that this movie is going to crash and burn so big. And, Mark Hamill was conspicuously absent from that because he's done. He fulfilled his contractual obligations, but that's it. He's got no interest in promoting this movie. George Lucas was conspicuously absent from the Monday premiere. And rumor has it that he wasn't even invited, but and again, I've got no way of confirming that. Maybe he wasn't invited, maybe he wasn't, turned it down. But, given reports of how betrayed he felt by Bob Iger and Disney for how they've treated his baby, it wouldn't surprise me that he didn't show up, because right now he's seething. I think he despises Bob Iger. I think he despises Kathleen Kennedy, especially for betraying him, because he only put her in charge of Lucasfilm because he wanted someone he felt would stand up for his vision there against whatever Bob Iger wanted to do. And she ended up sucking up to Bob Iger. So, yeah, when it gets to that point where even George Lucas and Mark Hamill cannot be bothered to come out in support of this thing, that's pretty bad. So, yeah. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below after this thing finishes processing. I do apologize for the constant cutting in and out. Like I said, my Wi-Fi where I am is really poor. But I wanted to do this live discussion sort of as a eulogy for Star Wars, because I think it genuinely is dead. Jar Jar Abrams and Ruan Johnson killed it between the two of them. And Abrams came along and just buried it under a mountain of shit. And we're probably not going to see another movie for at least another 10 years. And by that time, no one will have any interest because of the way the present trilogy has treated the original property and the characters and the actors involved. So, but yeah, so that's it. If you like what you've heard and you want to hear more, by all means, go ahead, hit the subscribe button and the bell icon and select all to receive notifications whenever we upload new content. If you want to help support the channel, head over to our Patreon or subscribe to our page. I've also got a GoFundMe link to a tech drive in the description below. Until next time, this is Michael Wilk for the Wilk Report saying take care, good night, I'm out. And that's pretty much it for streaming. Uh, but yeah, as far as actually recording, I'm going to go on for a few more minutes because I will be trying to do this as a Patreon special if you want to stick around and listen to more of my rambling because I don't go by scripts. I don't like because when I read from a script, it sounds like I'm reading from a script, and so what you get when you listen to me is just my thoughts coming out as they happen, uh, and that's pretty much it. I don't like to come across as fake because I think it does a disservice, and unfortunately, my schedule does not allow me to practice reading from a script or referring to notes with all the time and attention to detail that it deserves. At least not at this point. Now that might change, hopefully soon in the future, but that depends on my job situation and how much time I actually have to devote to recording and editing and all this other stuff. Because being a YouTuber, who actually makes a living off of being a YouTuber, so it takes a lot of time and effort, because you not only have to come up with storyboards or scripts if you read from a script, and you can pull that off without sounding fake or like you're reading from something. If and of course you take the time to record different segments and edit them together. That takes time and energy, which a lot of people don't necessarily have. And unfortunately, with my situation in life right now, with that just doesn't quite allow for it right now. So what I do is I just go ahead and I record my thoughts in real time, and it's not necessarily going to be cohesive or coherent, and sometimes I will repeat myself quite a few times before I'm satisfied that I've gotten the point across. But I don't ever want to come across as sounding fake to people. I want things to be organic and to sound like they're coming from a real person instead of just someone who's acting. So yeah, that's it. Um, and that's pretty much that's me. That's what you're getting. If you decide you want to become a patron, uh, please by all means do so. Whatever amount you can spare, because it really does take a lot of time and energy to devote to bringing you the best content that I can. And if I have to work like 2 or 3 jobs on top of doing this, I can't necessarily bring you the quality videos that I would like to. So the less I have to rely on uh, a schedule that doesn't allow for bringing you the content that I would like. If I can support myself through this, through Patreon and Subscribestar, or even like with a small business grant or something that would give me a little bit of breathing room and devote the time to make stuff that really is going to do justice to this format. Because I would like to do this full time eventually. But I need your help. So please, whatever you can. I want to get to at least 3,000 a month. Because where I'm living, it takes about that much a month in income to live. Because I have to have a place of my own, an apartment. And depending on which part of town I live in, that could go anywhere from 500 to 1,200 a month just in rent alone, and that doesn't even cover utilities or food costs. And so landlords, when they go ahead and rent out to people now, they want you to be making 3 times as much as it's going to cost for the rent, because they want you to be able to devote sufficient income to food and utilities that aren't covered in the rent to support yourself. And they're not going to rent out to you if the rent is going to take up over half or even all of your monthly income, and you don't have any money for food or utilities or whatever else, because they don't want to rent to people who are poor and can't so poor that they can't afford to pay even 500 or 350 a month. They want you to be able to make that. So yeah, so if I'm going to do this full time, I need to be able to pull in at least $3,000 a month. So, by becoming a patron, you're helping me uh, bring in that level of income that I need to afford a place of my own where I can, uh, at least a 2-bedroom apartment where I can have my own studio room and set up, and uh, that way I can show you my smiling mug instead of having to hide behind a title card. Um, but yeah, so that's pretty much it for now. I hope you didn't have too many problems on the live stream. I know at least one person tried to tune in and kept having issues with audio cutting out. I do apologize for that because, again, the Wi-Fi here isn't exactly stable, but, with any luck that will change. But, I need your help to do it. So uh, go ahead and contribute what you can. Uh, if it is enough where I can afford to get my own Wi-Fi, uh, or at least my own internet modem, that I can do streaming that doesn't cut out. That'll help out a lot. So that's it for now. Take care, everyone. Good night. I'm out of here. And if you do go see The Rise of Skywalker, please, for the love of God, don't pay money for it if you don't have to. Because this movie doesn't deserve to. Don't reward Disney by paying for this shit. Okay. Just don't, because I think you'll end up doing yourself a disservice and reward failure. And I think if anything, this should end the career of Jar Jar Abrams, Rian Johnson, Kathleen Kennedy, and Bob Iger. If there's any justice, it will do exactly that, but only if you refuse to reward them. Reward them for doing good, like with The Mandalorian, but don't reward them for Rise of Skywalker. So anyway, that's it. I'm gone. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.